welcome back to another edition of Inwarp Mag. I am Brooke, joined as always by my co-host Drew.
Hey everybody, we've been away for a while and we're happy to be back for another episode.
Definitely happy to be back. And today we're going to be talking about new player pitfalls in playing Warhammer 40K 10th edition.
Yeah, and for this episode, we are trying to gear it more towards playing the game rather than hobbying, because a lot of our last few videos have been about hobbying, and it's time to get into talking about the game more, because me and Brooke have some more games under our belt. We have more experience, and with experience, we've made many mistakes. So we would like to communicate our mistakes to other new players, so hopefully they can avoid mistakes that we've already made.
Definitely. Yeah, we have I've been playing a lot of 40K, and it's a lot of learning experiences. I've been playing boarding actions, which hopefully we will talk about in the future, but yeah, lots of games under our belt now. We feel like we can talk a little bit about new player pitfalls because we fell into some of these.
So let's get into the first one. The first one I feel like is beating a dead horse because we've brought it up so many times, even in hobby episodes. But
Right.
this one is don't meta chase in building lists. And I think we to actually bring a different sort of spin to this, what we really suggest for new players is to actually attempt to build your own lists, starting with more balanced lists, because it's going to help you understand why people put certain things together in the list. Once you are like, oh, and you start learning your army, you're like, that guy goes with this guy, and you understand that synergy between different units a lot more.
Right. There's a rule of cool that you kind of want to follow. You can, when you start into the game, you'll want to run the cool guy that you just painted, or the cool model that you're excited about. Don't go all into one certain synergy or into one certain SKU, because the more flexible your list is, you'll learn different unit roles within your army. If you have a unit that is a tank killer or armor killer or monster killer or whatever, like, you can have that and learn how to use that. But then you have something that can score objectives, and maybe you have something that, if you're a melee army, you can have something that's fast that wants to get in melee, and then you can have some fire support. You can have a long range unit that you can learn on how to best utilize them and set up firing lanes. But having a balanced list will teach you more about the game quicker than skewing into any one particular uh, strategy.
Yeah, and if like the meta for your list is just like one super killy small elite army or something like that, then you might miss out on some of the other cool play styles of a specific faction. So
Yeah,
um,
there's
you
there's
should,
certainly certain factions that will lean into one strategy. Like World Eaters is probably the easiest example. Like, they are the Unga Bunga rush at your opponent and hit them as hard as you can, and that's like all they want to do. And if you play
yeah.
them, then
That's
you
why
can
you
lean into
picked.
that.
That's why you picked that army. Is
Right.
you liked that, so that makes sense. But for orcs at least, There's actually different play styles. There's a lot of nuance in the way that you go about and whine around the battlefield and bashing your opponent in the face. There's different ways you can go about doing it. So trying out different units rather than just going, well, the best detachment right now is Warhorde or the Big Hun or whatever. So I'm gonna play only that. You won't. Maybe you play Cult of Speed and you find that's like really in your wheelhouse and that's something you enjoy playing. You're gonna play the game more if you really enjoy playing your list.
Yeah, I think some of this comes down to play style as well. And I would actually recommend playing non-meta lists or non-meta units, because think about it this way: if you play a meta list, you have been told that these units are good, and you know that they're going to be they're figured out. Those units are kind of figured out already. If you play something that's off meta or something that people aren't telling you to play, then you can try to figure out whether it is something that you either like playing or is good in how you play. Like, if you have a certain play style, you might go, oh, actually, I kind of like this unit. Like, I'll give you an example. For me, as a Space Wolves player, people tell you to run Thunderwolf Cavalry because they're the best thing. But I spent probably the majority of my time playing the game not playing them. I played them twice out of like a dozen games, and the army that I played mostly had Blade Guard vets with either Judiciar or Ragnar, and I learned that the Blade Guard vets in my playstyle is super good. Like I like the Blade Guard vets to take the middle with a Judiciar, and then if they get uh if they get attacked, then they can fight first, and they're kind of a defensive unit. Like it fit in my play style, but people aren't telling you as a Space Wolves player to go get a bunch of Blade Guard. They're telling you to go into the Thunderwolf cavalry. So I
Well,
learned through trial that Blade Guard vets are actually pretty good.
well, to add on to that a little bit before we move on to the next one, it's just because the meta says that certain units are good doesn't mean the units that aren't considered current meta aren't good. They might not
Right.
just be 100% points efficient, and you might learn, like you said, you really enjoy playing those units. And honestly, unless you're playing in a tournament, which you probably shouldn't if you're a new player. I mean, you can. I just don't think you would enjoy it, and your opponents probably won't enjoy it either. Um,
You would have to know the rules really well if you're
yeah.
trying to, because you
So
need to play fast.
so you're going to be going hopefully against other players that are more your skill level. So taking something that's off meta and maybe not 100% points efficient or whatever isn't going to cripple your army. So play stuff that's off. Don't be afraid to play stuff that's off meta, especially if it's appealing to you. You might find you really like it, and you might start building lists around that one thing because it it gives you enjoyment.
And doing that will teach you list building and how to build a list around what you like.
Mm-hmm.
But
So let's move on to the next one. So this one is something that I feel like has come up in every single game. Um, where
yeah, without a doubt.
yeah, so you get done playing a game, and I'm sure everybody's had this experience. You play a game, you get done, and you go back and you look at the rule book and you look at the rule, and it was something in the middle of the game you all assumed that you knew. You're like, oh, this is how the rule plays out. And you don't look it up. But then when you look up the rule after the game, you're like, oh my gosh, we played that rule wrong the entire game, and it might have changed the outcome of the game. So
Right.
this advice is if you don't know the rule, look it up.
Yeah. You, as a new player, have access to the 40K app or the online rules. So there's no excuse of not having the core rule book. The app is actually pretty good to look up rules. You can, you just have to make an account to be on the Warhammer. I think you have to make an account to have it. But you have access to the core rules through the Warhammer 40K app, and it has a search function to look up any rule that you need. It's so useful during the game. I'm When we play, it's often like, "Oh, how does that work exactly?" And I go, "Okay, I'll look it up." And I can pull out my phone and immediately start searching for that rule.
Hmm.
The thing that you don't want to do while looking up rules, and we encourage you to look up rules, but just don't linger on it because games take long already, and you don't want the game to take too long. It's good to get things right, but sometimes you just need to make a decision. If you can't find it right away, make a decision, go for it, look it up later after the game.
Yeah, sometimes you got to kind of be like a your own TO at some point, and you just make a ruling and you move on for the sake of time because you don't want your game to take 8 hours to finish like a 2,000 point game. And you all want to go back and hug your kids and kiss your wife and say, I missed you. Where have you been all my life? Um, but yeah, like it's good to play it right because it almost feels like a little dirty as a new player when you finish a game and you realize you're playing something wrong the entire time. You're like, I still haven't officially played my first game of 40K because I have never played it correctly.
We had that feeling after our first game. We talked
Yep.
about that in one of the episodes. It felt like we never actually got a game in because we played it so wrong. It was,
Hmm.
but this is one of the things that, as you're learning, being at the table, playing the game is going to make you learn rules better because you're going to be playing through those rules, and it'll uh stick in your memory because you've gone through it. Like you've gone through the fight phase, you know how the fight phase works. You've gone through the shooting phase. You know how the shooting phase works. Like you can understand how those things work after playing through it, and
Well,
especially when you have questions on it and you have to look it up and then you learn. That's, through failure or, through just not knowing that, and then you'll hopefully commit that to memory.
y- you'll usually know when it happens too, because something in the game will happen and you'll be like, that felt wrong. Like you'll
Mhm.
just have this sneaking suspicion when it happens in the game. You're like, we're not playing this right. But you might talk about the rules with your friend or whoever you're playing with and be like, is this how it's supposed to work? And you're both going to maybe come to the consensus that, yeah, I think this is how it's supposed to work. But when you're done, you're going to, that's why you look it up later. You're like, man, that interaction just felt bad. Like I just got decimated. And then you look up the rule and you're like, well, no wonder it felt bad. It shouldn't have happened. That's not how the rules work. So that's something else. It'll stick in your mind because it was a might have been a pain point in a past game, and you're never going to forget that rule again.
I'll give you an example from our very first game, and I remember this still. And you can check the podcast history and see how far back it was our first game. Uh, in our first game, we did the fight phase, and we were just learning. And during the consolidate step, we didn't realize that even though it's a mandatory, you could move 0 inches. Uh, you were forced to consolidate into my unit, and then I attacked you and, like, killed your unit. Do you remember that in the middle of the
Mm-hmm.
board? And it was like, "Why would that be the case?" And I remember, like, looking it up later, and it was like, "Oh, that makes sense." 'Cause I think I was watching a play on, actually. I was watching them play, and they went through a fight phase, and they didn't, like, force consolidate into a nearby unit, and I was like, "Why didn't they do that?" And then I looked it up, figured it out, and then I think I messaged you, and I was like, "You don't have to do that. Like, we got that wrong." And those are the things that you remember the most. I still remember from our first game one of those things.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So I think moving on to the next one, which kind of plays in probably to more people who are playing maybe their first few games, or if you're Brooke, still playing like
Yeah.
your 10th or 11th game.
Hey.
um, Next piece of advice is to know your army and detachment rules and don't forget it.
Yeah, know them. I know my detachment rules and I know my army rules. I know Champions of Rust like the back of my hand. But when I'm in the heat of the moment and I'm rolling my attacks in melee, I will forget what things I have
Brooke
active and I
Brooke
will just
rolls
ignore them.
Brooke rolls all of his uh, dice for hit rolls, and I'm like, he picks them up. I'm like, did you roll any sixes? Ah.
I'm like, "Oh no, I don't know. I don't remember." Or like at the end of a round, I'll have like one of the things that triggers a saga to be completed. Like one of my leaders is below half health and he survived to the end of the round. So Saga the Bear should be active. And I just totally forget about it. I'm not thinking about that. I'm more just like I'm like battle shocked personally. Like I got battle shocked and I'm just like, oh, my guy's at half health. And I'm not thinking about my saga and remembering my rule.
Mm-hmm.
Remember your rules. We played a game this weekend and I still forgot a bunch of my rules.
You
It
forgot
happens
sustained hits like through half of the
a
game,
bunch.
and I was like, "Are you doing sustained hits over there? Because you're rolling on the other side of the room from me."
Yeah, it was like half. It was probably like the first half of the of like one of our turns. I was totally forgetting to do it, and then I was like, "Oh yeah," and then I think I did it the rest of the game. Turned out later, we were talking about it today, and I forgot that Saga the Bear should have been activated literally like the first turn, and then I should have had it for the rest of the game, and my guys would have been a lot more survivable. But
Mm-hmm.
it is what it is. You just got to remember it. I actually bought a little reminder tool for my army for Champions of Rust, so I wouldn't forget this. It's just not here yet. But I bought this little thing that says what is active and what's not active. Like it's this little like wooden magnetic thing that I can put the Saga magnet on it that says, "Hey, this one's active," and then I have it with me all the time. So
Yeah.
I'm working on that. But yeah, you should know your army rule, know your detachment rule, and try not to forget it.
And it's especially important because a lot of balance into different armies comes from their army and detachment rules. So if you don't know them, you might play a game, and if you don't use any of your possible bonuses that you may get, you might be getting bodied and think this feels really bad, but then there might have been an army or detachment rule that have would have swung the things in your favor, and you wouldn't have felt so bad playing the game. So
Right.
if you ever have a really bad game, maybe reread your army and detachment rules. But if you know them all and you're still having a bad game, then I don't know what to do for you. Maybe hopefully our advice later in the podcast will help you out. Um, some other things to talk about with detachment rules is your detachment's stratagems are very useful to know because there are usually some really cool synergies that you can do by using some of those stratagems in like a key situation. Like, for example, for Warhorde, uh, with Gaz, with his lethal hits on the Wa turn with Makari's banner, you can use the unbridled carnage stratagem to get 5 up crits. So you start triggering lethal hits on a 5 up, and then with Warhorde you're getting sustained 1 on a 5 up also. So knowing how all of that plays together, if you read the Unbridled Carnage stratagem on itself, you're just like, okay, 5 up crits, that's not that great. But then that triggers your lethal hits and your sustain, so it's really good and it snowballs.
Yeah, I would say there's a lot of detachments that their stratagems actually kind of shape the army sometimes more than the actual detachment rule it does. Like one example of that for Space Marines is the Anvil Siege Force, which is the like Imperial Fists army. The Imperial Fists detachment rule, the Anvil Siege Force, is kind of boring, and you're like, okay, like that's fine. But then if you look at the stratagems, and if you start using those stratagems pretty consistently on like key units, you can get a lot of power out of just the stratagems.
Mm-hmm.
Um, like that is a key thing for that army for Champions of Russ. One of the things that empowers one of my units super super well, and it plays into my detachment rules. My detachment rules are the sagas, and the sagas unlock additional abilities in my stratagems. And one of those things is if I have the Warrior Born saga completed that gives me sustained hits 1, and I use the Relentless Assault stratagem, it gives me advanced charge on like a Thunderwolf Cavalry. So if I have a Wolf Lord who can get a free stratagem because he has the -1 to a CP cost, because he's a captain effectively, he can for free use Relentless Assault to get advanced charge on that unit, which empowers that one unit to zoom across the board and do what it's supposed to do. Like that stratagem synergy with my army and detachment rule combo, it enables that part of my list to do what it needs to do. And if I didn't know those things combo together, I would otherwise lose a lot of power.
Yeah, if you like for this weekend when we played, for example, I might not give it away just because maybe we'll do a episode on this later, but we played a doubles game with friends of the show, Bill and Bear, and you would look at a unit of 5 knobs being led by a war boss and think there's no way they can take on a Lehman Russ, or not a Lehman Russ, a Rogel
Larogel
Dorn,
Dorn.
but they can.
Yeah, it
So
turns out 5 knobs in a war boss is pretty strong.
yeah, so like if you know your army rules, you know your detachment rules, and your stratagems that you have at your disposal, you can use those to really high efficiency to basically make your army, run like a fine-tuned machine.
Definitely. And I think to move on to the next one, this is something that I've certainly learned over playing lots of games is you don't want to judge a unit based on a small sample size. There's certain units that I've played that I was not a fan of initially, and then I tried them again, and I was like, "Oh, okay, like this unit's actually pretty good." Um, so if you, I'll give you an example from. I mean, not to give away everything from the doubles game, but I had some units. I had a couple units that did really bad, uh, and basically did nothing. And if I, didn't take this advice, I would never play them again. So but I know that they're better than what they were. They just kinda it was part of it was bad luck. My dice were so bad at that time.
Mhm.
But the other part of it too was I, you know, arguably put it in a bad spot, and I paid for it. So learning from that and understanding how best to use a unit is my first time using that unit. Um, don't judge that unit based on just like one or two games. Like
Mhm.
have some patience, try to learn what it does. If it doesn't make sense to you initially, then maybe you look online and see if there's any resources of like, hey, how do I play this unit? And somebody is bound to have something online that's like, okay, like I use them to do this. And, I find they're most effective when they do that. Like people have figured out a lot of units and their uses, and maybe it's just not clicking for you. And when it does, then maybe you'll find a spot for it in your army.
Mhm. Also, just maybe you learn that you don't know how to use a specific unit yet, and you might see another person using a very similar unit, and you'll just something will click all of a sudden. You'll be like, I want to run that now because I can see how useful that would be in my list. It might
Right.
not be the exact same unit, but like maybe the points cost and the role, like it could be a screening unit or something like that, and you can just see how pivotal it could have been to have in a past game you played. um, an example, a different example of a unit that if I had judged it based off of the first time I used it, I I would have never used it again. But now I know how effective it is knobs with a war boss.
Oh yeah.
So the first time I played knobs with the war boss against Brooke, I I had a full unit of 10 with a war boss, and I charged head on into his screening unit of Fenrisian wolves, and I just ate the screen up. And Ragnar and his blade guard moved up
Yep.
into me, and they just wrecked me. Like one swing of Ragnar's sword or whatever, and it's just like seven knobs were dead, and I was just like, "Holy crap! These guys suck. I hate them. I'm gonna
Yeah.
retire from Warhammer 40K right now." But in this previous bit of advice, I was telling you about how good the knobs were and how much they swung up from their points value. So do not judge a unit based off of one bad game that you had with them. It might not have been. It might have been you, like it was in my case, but maybe you're just going against something that was countering that unit, and
Yeah.
whoever you're playing knew how to counter that specific unit because they had experience with it, and it felt bad. But don't give up on it, especially if it's something you think you like.
Right. Yeah. I think in our first game, I played with Bjorn, and I was like, oh, he's really strong. Like in our very, very first game at Adepticon, he like went up against Mazrog and took out Mazrog, and I was like, man, I'm psyched. Like he's amazing. And then in my second game, he walked out to the war rig or whatever that's called, the
The battle wagon.
battle wagon, and he walked out to that, and I was like, I'm gonna take on the battle wagon. And then he got killed by boys. Boys jumped out of the battle wagon and beat him to death. And I was like, what the like he sucks. I was really frustrated.
Mm-hmm.
And I've played with Bjorn in every single list I've played, I think. Like except for like obviously like boarding actions, but I've played with Bjorn in basically every list. And he's like one of my favorite units because he fits my play style. I like using him, and I've learned how to use him, but I didn't like stop using him because I had a bad time with him one game. Like stick with something that might not seem good right away, and try it again and see if you can figure it out, because if you do, it could be something that you really enjoy playing in the future.
Yeah, definitely.
Um so the next thing that we want to talk about is paying attention to rules and the phases that they apply. There's a lot of this is particularly important in the rules commentary. There's a lot of rules that and this is also pretty prevalent in stratagems too. It will call out the specific phase, or whether it's your phase or both phases or your opponent's phase. But if you pay attention to the phases that things apply, those are going to be very, very important, and maybe avoid some, uh, I guess, problems in the future when you run into that. But like,
Yeah,
I'll
like
give you an
the
example. Oh, go ahead.
I was gonna say like the piece of advice we gave earlier of it, if you don't know the rule, look it up. Especially when you're reading the rule, pay attention to the phase because you might read the rule and you think it applies, but if you read what phase it applies, you'll be like, oh, okay, this does not work right now. Go ahead and you can give your specific example.
Yeah, and I just to add on what you just said there is like you might understand a rule, but you might not understand the phase that it exactly applies to. And the example that I want to use is actually from this weekend. We all thought we understood the big guns never tire rule, and I thought I understood it. We all played it a certain way, and come to realize that big guns never tire only applies in your shooting phase. So if you have a vehicle with big guns never tire, your vehicle can shoot into and out of melee, or into it can shoot at. Sorry, a vehicle can be shot at or shoot out of melee. Um, but all the normal targeting applies for a unit that is that for this vehicle that's shooting.
And they get
So
-1 to hit, right?
yeah, and they get -1 to hit for shooting while engaged. Um, so that only applies during your shooting phase. So when it's your turn and you have a vehicle that's in melee, they can shoot out of it or shoot into the people that are engaged with it. It can shoot into those. And actually, like just an aside on this specific rule and other rules like it, if you look at the 40K 10th edition core rules, there's all those like quick hitting boxes, like there's like those summary boxes, and they're great. They're really good for like, quickly glancing, you kind of get the gist of the rule, but there's often some additional details in the paragraphs above that you need to pay attention to, and this is one of those. This is exactly one of those things where the big guns never tire applies to your shooting phase, not all shooting phases. So the example here is in our last game. Um, there was the Rogel Dorn, and it was engaged in melee and with Thunderwolf Cavalry, and it overwatched. And it should not have been able to overwatch if we knew this rule correct. Was if we knew how to use this rule correctly. So, with that being said, the rules and the phases in which they apply are super important. It's super important to read and read carefully, like when everything applies, because you might, be getting a benefit or you know, get got on about, something like this, just because you assume that it applies to all phases and it really doesn't. And it's an honest mistake that we all make.
Hmm.
I've made it with some rules of my own. Um, it also applies to, I think I was trying to use a, oh yeah, okay, this is another one. In the game, I was trying to use Armor of Contempt when I got overwatched, and it turns out Armor of Contempt does not apply in the movement phase. It's only during your opponent's shooting phase. So I could not use Armor of Contempt. And at that time, I did look up that and I was like, oh, it doesn't apply. I can't use it right now. And so I wasn't able to use it.
Hmm.
So that's another one, like paying attention to the phasing there. So yeah, this is something that we wanted to hit on kind of quickly, but it's a super important thing. Read your rules, read your rules carefully, read the full paragraph, pay attention to the rules commentary, and know exactly when rules apply to which phases.
Hmm. So the next piece of advice is to play the objective. One thing that you might find yourself getting caught up in, especially if you're not familiar with or haven't had a lot of experience with playing war games, is you immediately want to get on the board and you're like, I want to kill some things. And you forget about the objective. You forget that it's an objective game. So you could be winning the game by 30 victory points and think you're doing poorly and have a bad time because you aren't killing things because that's the goal you've set for yourself in your head. But remember that it's an objective based game. Um, then another additional piece of advice with that, with Warhammer 40K, you have your primary and secondary objectives. I think our advice for new players is to always take tactical secondaries while you're still learning the game. Um, that way you can see all the different types of secondaries that you can do. So, real quick for new players, when you pick your secondary objectives, you can have fixed where you have a set of secondary objectives. You pick 2 of those, and those are your secondaries for the entire game. Otherwise, if you go tactical, every turn you can draw up to 2 um, secondary objectives, and you'll when you're learning the game, you'll see how like when you score them, you turn it in, and then you'll get a new one during your next command phase. But yeah, we suggest playing tactical while you're learning the game.
The other name for tactical is the fun secondaries because you get all the random objectives, and it's more fun to react to it. And I mean, I'm being a little facetious here, but I think tactical makes for a more casual, I guess, maybe gameplay where you're trying to react to your secondaries. It'll also teach you how to score each objective. So in the future, if you do want to go tactical, or sorry, fixed, if you do want to go fixed where you select two, you're gonna have a decent idea of how each of those secondaries plays and how easy they are to score.
Mm-hmm.
So when you go to maybe elevate your play to maybe start getting a little bit more competitive and dipping your toe into that, you might consider fixed because you've been playing tactical, you understand most of the secondaries pretty well, and when you go up against a certain matchup, you go, okay, they have this, this, and this. I'm going to go for this secondary set, or
Or
I
your
set up my
list,
army to do this.
yeah.
Right? Yeah,
Uh,
like I set up my army to do this very specific thing, and I've optimized it to do these two fixed secondaries.
mm-hmm.
Uh, But understanding that and trying to figure out which playing the objective is obviously super important. You might feel like you're losing and you're actually winning because you're winning on objective points, and you need to understand when that is. And that's something that I'm still learning how to understand, because sometimes we all get to the table and we all want to roll dice, we all want to see our things kill stuff, and we all want to like do cool things on the table, right? And
Mm-hmm.
then when your stuff doesn't, you feel bad, but it could mean that you're still winning. You could still be winning just based on how you're playing the objective, even if you're not getting the kills that you expect or that you want. And just understanding the difference between I'm winning or my things are just not killing stuff like I want them to, like understanding the difference of those things is pretty important as a new player.
Yeah, I think you need to understand what the value is of your unit at the time you're playing it, because it isn't always killing something that makes it valuable. For example, I had a unit of boys with a war boss that in my mind I'm like they're gonna fly in on a truck, jump out of the truck on the wat before at the wat turn basically, and then just charge in and smash something's face. It just didn't turn out that way, and their value turned out to be capturing the center primary objective. And boys have sticky now, so I stickied the center objective, and it turned out to be pivotal. And they might not have traded their points value in any way, but what they did by capturing and sticking that center objective was so valuable to the game.
Right. Understanding this kind of call back to list building, understanding what your list can do and understanding your unit roles. You might have in mind that this unit is going to be a kill unit, but understanding that it can also do an objective, like boys can also stick an objective, and understanding those things and those synergies is very important.
Yeah, and don't forget that rule if you have a unit that
Yeah.
says you sticky the objective, because I forgot it halfway through the game and I was like, oh wait, I have
Yeah.
sticky.
Yeah, it turned out to be pretty clutch.
Mm-hmm. So I think that's pretty much it for objectives. You have anything else you want to say on that one, Brooke, before we move on?
No, I think you've pretty much touched on everything. Playing the objective, you just remember it's an objective game. It's not team deathmatch. Just
Mm-hmm.
learn to play the objective.
All right. So the next piece of advice is learn how to stage your army. So along with learning how to stage your army, it's important to learn terrain and especially like ruins rules. Uh, Understanding those is going to help you stage your army better and know how you can move around or maybe even through the ruins, depending on what type of unit you have, and understanding how line of sight is drawn through ruins as well. And learning to stage your army is critical for both melee and shooting armies because if you even if you are maybe not playing a melee army, and staging is really important to melee armies, knowing how your opponent is attempting to stage for like a melee alpha strike is important to preventing it.
Right. Yeah, I think you do this better than any of us. I think you do this best using because you run orcs and you have to stage like with your trucks and transports. I kind of do it with the things that I have, but they don't have to get out. I've not used transports like you have.
Mm-hmm.
This is super. Yeah, it's a super important thing to learn how to stage your army. And like you were saying, for a shooty army, you can stage your army to get ready to jump into the firing lanes and shoot at your opponent, who is also staging their army behind some key line of sight blocking ruins, and you get angles on them. Uh, but like staging that push up to get in those firing lanes as a shooting army is super important because you don't want to expose your army too soon where you just get shot off the board, because you want your opponent to expose themselves so that when you move out you can shoot them. So there is like this like cat and mouse game there of like staging your army, knowing when to jump out, knowing when to commit to an alpha strike if you're a melee army. Those things are very important. It's the you know can you maybe define staging your army for like a brand new player who maybe not is not familiar with that term?
Yeah, so infantry, for instance, they can move through ruins, and ruins are going to be one of your primary line of sight blockers. So typically, what you're going to do is you're going to move your units up into a ruin, and they're going to be about like little an inch away from the ruin wall. Essentially, what you're doing is you're giving yourself the best position to be able to move through that ruin. Uh, you basically move out the furthest, but you're also preventing your opponent from moving through the ruin and attacking you, because they will not, they have to be able to set up inside the ruin and attack you, and they can't move through you. So you
And
can
they
set yourself up in such a way that you can't get attacked, but on your turn you will be able to go out and attack them. And then also another thing is understanding your like threat ranges. So understanding if your army has a rule like next turn I'm going to have advance and charge. So what does a 9-inch move look like from here? And then what is my charge range going to be if I do a 9-inch move? Is it something that I'm going to be able to very easily, you know, convert, or do I need to save a command point for a CP reroll or something like that on a charge? So just keeping stuff like that in mind of what are my threat ranges, and then how can I move up without being shot at?
right. Yeah, staging, put simply, is the setup for your strike, right?
Yeah,
It's the setup that you use to position your army in a way in which they're safe, and the next turn they'll be able to strike.
there's
And
there's tons of great videos online from competitive players who will teach you how to stage your army, and honestly, like I've watched those videos and absorbed some of their knowledge, but it's once you know about it, you really have to practice it to
yeah,
get good at it. And then on the other side, I talked about understanding how a melee army might be staging can help you as a shooting army, because in most shooting armies, you're going to have some sort of unit that is a screening unit. If you know how somebody is staging and you can see it coming before it happens, you can get that screening unit out in front of your main army before they get into you, and basically prevent the alpha strike.
right. Like I would use the example, like Bill is playing Astra Militarum right now a lot.
Hmm.
We're gonna have to change his avatar when he comes back on. But when he runs Astra Militarum, his tanks are the highest value units in his army.
Hmm.
And when he goes up against like me or you who run melee armies, melee focused armies, um, he wants to recognize that we're staging because we're trying to get our melee stuff, getting ready to make a big charge. And then if he recognizes that, then he puts his Cadians, just normal soldiers, in a line, basically in a big blob right in front of his tank, and says, "You can't get to my tank. You have to go and shoot through all the Cadians before you get anywhere close to my tank." So
Hmm.
they'll catch the melee threat, and this like 60-point unit will die, and then it will keep the tank safe to then keep shooting and shoot something else that's maybe not in melee, or move away, retreat, get it, get to where they need to be. But that sacrifice of the screening unit, recognizing that a melee threat is coming, that sacrifice will keep your actual valuable key unit alive. So the staging kind of goes both ways. You want to learn how to stage your own stuff, and then learn how to recognize that your opponent is staging for an attack and know how to counter that.
Yeah, and it can be multiple things that you need to understand too. So it can be like we said, moving screening units out in front for a charging melee unit, but it might also be, in that initial deployment, you unfortunately, if you don't know all of the different armies play styles and you encounter something for the first time, hopefully that opponent, this is a piece of advice we don't have listed here, but you should walk through like the gotchas of your opponent's army. So like if you're playing against world eaters or something like that, they have a lot of scout, so they can get out on the board quick. So if you know they have scout and say you have something that can infiltrate, well, you could infiltrate something out ahead to try to prevent some of those scout moves ahead of time. So there's stuff like that too, where like World Eaters is going to scout out to get this like real quick alpha strike on me. What can I do to prevent that from happening to my Tau army or whatever you're playing that's more ranged focus?
And to that point, I think that's a really good point. If you're playing your first few games and you are not familiar with your opponent's army, which you shouldn't have to be, right? If you're playing with friends, ask your buddy, "Hey, like, what gotchas do you have? Like, what do I need to be aware of that you can just like, wombo combo me out of nowhere if I didn't know the rule? Like, tell me your gotchas, and then I'm aware of them, and then if I forget them later, that's on me." And if you go
Hmm.
into a tournament or like your local game store and you're playing against a random, you can do the same thing. It's actually an acceptable question for a wide majority of players.
I think in the
If you go
community, it's really considered good sportsmanship to do that,
right.
especially for a new player who's unfamiliar. Do you want to be the person who's known for just like beating up the noobs? They'll be like, "Oh, it's Tanpa, the rookie crusher, or whatever."
Oh yeah. Wow, great reference. Dang.
Yeah.
I love it.
So you don't want to be Tonpa, the rookie crusher. Like, help people along like if there's new people. Um, Everyone was new at some point, and hopefully you have the empathy to understand what it was like when you were a new player too. Show them some empathy, be a good sport, and then tell them your gotchas. And if you are new and you aren't sure, do not be afraid to ask them like, "Hey, what can your army do? I'm not familiar with Votan."
Right.
So,
Like, and maybe you might be thinking about a move, and this has happened before where like I'll be like about to make a move, and I'll just like ask my opponent or like Bill or something. I'll be like, "Hey, do you have any like reactive moves that I should be aware of?" He's like, "Oh no," and I'm like, "Okay." Like I'm just thinking about like things that might get me if I do this, and that I could like if there's a gotcha that I, you know, am not aware of that he has. I'll just be like, "Can you do this?" And he's like, "No, I can't." Or
mhm.
if I like, are you able to counter this in some way that I don't know of, like in a stratagem or something? Like that sort of stuff is okay to ask. You should ask. Just understand what they have available to them. It is public knowledge, and they should be willing to give that to you.
Yeah, and if you really wanted to, you could just grind the entire game to a halt and look it up yourself and be like, "I'm gonna look up this rule to see if you can do anything. Do you want to just tell me?" So that's why it's
Yeah,
really considered good sportsmanship to tell people like what you can do.
and actually, a callback to the earlier point that we had. If you don't know every single rule, then don't play 40K. If you don't know every single army, if you don't know every single detachment, then I don't know why you're playing. And I hope this
JK.
reads as sarcasm because that would be insane if you actually knew all that crap. There's too much to know in this game. Like,
Mm-hmm.
ask your opponent. They know their stuff, you know your stuff. Share the knowledge.
Yep. All right. So the next piece of advice we have is target priority. So something that came up in our last game that was really important. Well, it may not have turned out how we would have liked, but you need to understand which target is your priority because it could be mission important or it could just happen to be a really important unit that is going to enable your opponent's list to do a lot of bad things to your list. And you need to understand, this thing is a big threat. Doing that threat assessment, we need to take care of this. And when you pick a priority target, you need to avoid splitting your fire into other things that are less important because once you waste, I wouldn't say waste, maybe waste is a bad word, but once you take a shot into what you assessed as your priority target with maybe one of your more important units, once you start splitting off of that onto other things, you're like, oh, I didn't kill it. I'm not going to kill it with anything. And you start shooting other things, then you wasted that first shot that you took. So when you pick a priority target, you need to stick with it.
Yeah, I think Playon puts this well. They say overkill is best kill. Like,
Mm-hmm.
if you're looking to kill something, overkill it. Like, don't try to be like, oh, my one las cannon can take it out on the last shot. I'll do one las cannon here and the other las cannon over there. Like, just overkill it because you might whiff. And, I whiffed super hard in our last game, like multiple times. So, knowing that you need to take something out and prioritizing taking that out and not assuming that one thing can take it out, make sure you take out your priority targets. Understanding what is the priority target is super important. If you are looking at your opponent's list and you can ask them, hey, like, what's your most valuable unit in your army, like points wise? Or you could say, like, what is your most important unit? Like, I'm not familiar with your army, like, what is your most important thing? And they'll like point to their guy and they'll be like, oh, this character, he does this thing. Or, this guy, this tank is 300 points. Or, oh, this Primarch, it's Mortarion, by the way, he's super important.
He's really
And you're
good.
like, okay, yeah. Oh, I should probably kill the big winged Mothman. Like, okay, I should probably kill. Like, understanding, just asking the question if you're not sure is a good place to start. But trying to assess like what is the priority, and that could be to kill and stop your opponent from having that piece in their army, or the priority could be stopping your opponent from running an objective, or it could be to complete one of your objectives.
Mm-hmm.
Like we had that happen in our last game where we were trying to prioritize getting a kill,
On a
and
vehicle
on a vehicle, it
because we had
didn't end
bring
up
it down.
working. Yeah, it didn't end up working, but we kind of just desperately threw dice at it to just try to get the kill, and it didn't end up working. It,
Brooke
it kind of
Brooke
paid
was
off in the.
Brooke was a little blinded by the dark side at this point, and he really wanted to just kill something. And I'm like, no, 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 you can't just kill for the sake of getting a kill, and it will feel good. You need to, and he wouldn't have killed a unit or anything, but it was
No,
like
I just
we
wanted to
need
get the
to
models
finish
killed.
off the vehicle, so attack the vehicle, like because
Yeah.
we did stand a real chance of putting. We didn't need to put a lot more damage through, and he stood a real chance of finishing it off. And it's like, give it a shot. We really need to get these points.
Yeah, it was like I have a good chance of killing. I had precision. I had a good chance of killing a leader, which would activate my Beast Slayer saga, which would be really good, but not necessary. And it would just be good for my army. Or we could do Bring It Down and get a bunch of points with Bring It Down. And it was like, okay, like, all right, let's do Bring It Down because it's the priority based on what our objectives are at the moment. Like, we need to try to complete the objective. I can't be selfish and try to go after my own personal saga. So that's what ended up having. That's what ended up being the best move at that time. Like, understanding your priority in that moment is important as a new player.
Yeah, I have to say our last game was great for a lot of teaching moments, but we can't be super specific with them right now
Yeah,
because we
because
don't
we
think
want
we want to talk about it.
We don't want to spoil anything, but yeah, we had a ton of learning experiences in that game.
But yeah, like we could have gone for the kill on something else and it might have felt good. You might see a unit of Gretchen that are camping back on the back objective for your opponent, and you could just shoot them right off of the board. But then you go, what is that really going to help my army? Because he has another unit of Gretchen in reserves that he can just bring in to camp that objective again. Or should I maybe shoot something, you know, about to smash me in the face or something, or that's really
Right.
enabling my opponent to win the game? Um,
Yeah,
so
it's
go ahead.
just a callback. Just a callback to like I guess this not even a callback. This goes into our final point, I guess, in about all of this. Playing the game, practicing is your is the probably the biggest piece of advice that we can give a new player. Play the game, practice, and have patience. You're gonna learn, and then you're gonna keep learning. And I've played probably a dozen games at this point, and I'm still learning. We learned a lot in our last game. Still, like you will continue to learn the game. That's one of the fun things about it is it's hard to solve the game when there's so much going on and there's a lot of stuff going on in your own army and your opponent's army, but being able to practice and having people that you play with who are okay with these practice games of we're both learning and we're both going to be asking questions, like that's I think that's important. Or like having a local game store where you make some friends and you all are happy to do that um, at the local game store. But the important part of practice is being intentional about it, which to me is you need to reflect on the game after you complete it. You need to reflect on what worked, what didn't, what could I have done better, those sorts of things. The learning process after the game, asking questions, sitting down with your opponent and being like, what could I have done better? Like, did you see anything that I did that was a misplay or whatever? Like, just having those conversations with your friends and being open about it and not really bringing like your ego of being like, I thought I did really good, and then they're like, well, if you did this instead of this, then I wouldn't have been able to do this objective. Like something like that. That learning experience is super important.
Or on the flip side is if you just feel like you played really bad, but then you need to like look at the entire outcome of the game. What were the victory points? How did I do on my primary? How did I do on my secondaries? And you might actually find out, like, upon reflection of that game, it was kind of unorthodox for how my army usually plays, but I played it pretty well. And just like understanding what you did well in that game and why did it work. You might find like some perhaps incidental moves that you made that seemed very unimportant at the time you did them had huge consequences to the total outcome of the game. And the reflection part is really important to look back of like, why did it turn out in my favor so well? What moves did I make that aided my army? And that's one reason I really want to talk about our last game, because
Yes.
it was pretty unorthodox for how me and Brooke are used to playing with our lists, because we want to we both want to always kill things with our melee focused armies.
Yeah. Unga Bunga hit things hard. Yeah.
And I can just as a little sneak peek, it didn't go that way for us, but we still did pretty good.
Yeah. Reflecting. Yeah. It's like no spoilers, but after the game, we spent a lot of time reflecting on both teams on what we did. And it was a very, very good learning experience. And I would say, hands up over here, for me especially, I learned a lot in that game. There was a lot to reflect on where things in the moment didn't seem a certain way, or, things in the moment seemed a different way. And, the way that they played out in the end were completely different and things that I didn't really expect. And then hearing how, if you, again, if you're open with your opponent, we talked with Bill and Bear about, and they were telling us like what they were thinking in certain moments and like hearing what our moves which we thought, like you said, were incidental or some things that we didn't really care about. And they were thinking, oh my gosh, we need to deal with this thing that we thought was incidental. And, that is important knowledge to just kind of like get out of your own head and try to understand what your opponent's thinking and try to understand the value that you're getting with any given unit. Like try to look past maybe, I don't know, you're whiffing on stuff. Like try to understand that, okay, I might be whiffing. Yes, that sucks. Like we all want to roll dice and hit things and do damage. But if in whiffing you're serving a purpose, it might be worth it. It might be worth it literally to whiff, which in this case it kind of did. Just understanding that is going to make you a better player. You need to uh, do the practice to understand when those situations are happening and be patient when you're playing the game because you might learn through a what you think is a bad experience and that might influence your next game and help you understand what was going right when you thought everything was going wrong.
Yeah, not all victories, especially if you're looking at it from a war game military perspective, not all victories are going to be these overwhelming victories. There can be Pyrrhic victories at some point. And I'll say Pyrrhic in the fact of like my army got decimated, but I still won the game,
Yeah.
and that would be like a Pyrrhic victory. It's just like think of like D-Day if you know your history, for instance.
Yeah.
Like it, there's no way that felt good at the time, but what they gained out of D-Day became such a huge stepping stone to establishing that foothold in Europe and winning the war in Europe. So you have to always like look at the big picture of like what was the outcome. Um,
Hmm.
and again, we're touching on that reflection. You really got to reflect on the game and just think about big picture. What happened? Why
Right.
why did that happen? You really got to think through those things, and as you practice, you get these points where you can reflect on what happened. So,
And in reflecting, you're going to go back to all of our points that we were talking about before. And you're gonna learn things about each of those. Like, I'll give you one example. You'll learn a role that your unit filled in that game that you didn't realize it was going to fill when you built the list and when you started playing. But at the end of the game, you reflect on what that unit did and you go, "Oh, it actually did something I didn't expect it to do. Even the way I was running it, it actually accomplished something that I was not expecting." And then you'll learn from that. And then you'll learn in the future, okay, this unit has potential to do this thing that I didn't even think it could. And that's going to help you be a better player.
and you can listen to us and other YouTubers who give advice on like competitive play all you want, but until you practice and understand it for yourself or experience it yourself, you're not really going to um, take that advice in necessarily and retain it um, until it until you've done it. So somebody might tell you, like you were saying, that this unit is really good at killing, but it is also really good at this other thing. Like maybe it's really good at screening or something like that, but you've never done it before, and like you might have done it incidentally, and you're like, oh, like that felt bad because I didn't get the kill, but that basically just was a logjam for their entire army the way I was able to screen with that unit. So it's just like you're going to learn a lot more about how you can play your army, and that stuff will be so valuable for your future games because you will see those scenarios coming up more in the game and you'll be like, "Oh, I can do this right now and this is going to enable me to do whatever I want with my army at this point in time."
Right. Yeah. Practice, practice, have patience. Uh, you'll learn and grow as a player and hopefully you'll enjoy that process. That's part of the fun, learning and getting better and every game should be fun with your friends
Mhm.
and having that reflection at the end will also create stories and we have a lot of stories that came out of this last game and lots of other games we have stories that we laugh about after the game and that's part of the fun not just as a trying to get better as a new player but those stories that you have after the game that you reflect on certain things that happen in the game will make for fun, like, inside jokes with your friends.
Yeah, like our last game felt like we were getting curb stomped for like 5 hours, but after the game, felt really, believe it or not, invigorated to play another game after
Yeah.
the curb stomping because it was just a very unorthodox game for us. And I was just like, wow, I learned a lot and I want to play another game to have another experience like that.
Yeah, definitely.
All right. So I think that's pretty much that's all the advice we have for you guys for today. So if we haven't thought of any other advice that you think is important for new players, go ahead and leave a comment because we'd like to hear anybody else's advice because we are still new players and we're not above taking advice still.
Yes, definitely. And if you like the content, please leave a like and a subscribe if you are willing to do that. There is like a little bell down there if you want to hit that. I'm just kidding. That's cringe to ask for
Smash
people
the
to do that.
notification bell.
But if you want to, if you do want to, if you do like our content, please do leave us a like. It definitely helps. And if you are a new player, we recommend that you go check out our shorts that we've put out. We have a fight phase, shooting phase, and a charge phase short, and we hope to fill those out later with more beginner friendly, quick, getting up to speed gameplay tips.
Yeah, help you learn the rules quicker so you can start playing the game quicker with your friends because that's important.
Yep. And again, we hope you guys enjoyed this, and we'll catch you guys next time.
Yep. Later, guys.